I'll start off the video by saying that I don't really have a lot of nice things to say about Dehya in this first impression video. I don't think she's as bad as most people nearly make it out to be, but overall I do think she's rather terrible, at least in my first impression playthrough. So if that is an idea that kind of scares you, maybe this video is not for you. But for those of you who are going to be staying, you might as well subscribe if you're here already, right? So we'll click that button and then let's get started. Dehya is a newly released 5-star character in Genshin Impact that was highly anticipated by a lot of people, mostly because she does have, in my personal opinion, a really nice design. I mean, just look at this. But unfortunately, in terms of her gameplay though, she is a hot mess. Is she a defensive utility character? Is she an offensive utility character? As it turned out, she's basically nothing. And let's get into explaining why that is the case. First thing first, when it comes down to Dehya over my playthrough, I found that she did really lackluster damage. Now this might be something that you have heard from a lot of people already, and to be honest, during my playthrough it was not really any different. However, just like every other first impression video on this channel, I want to make sure that focus is not the damage itself, but rather the actual character kit itself. So we're going to be looking at Dehya from a gameplay partner perspective. Does she has any obvious issues or caveat like energy recharge, or maybe she's unable to perform some action with some support in the game, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today instead. Obviously damage is one of the problem, and I'll mention it at relevant spot, but again I want to make sure that you are not too focused on the damage aspect about Dehya as well. Dehya kind of acts as a pseudo defensive utility with mostly her elemental skill. By dropping her elemental skill on the ground, it creates a field that will give you a various amount of benefit. The biggest one is the damage migration mechanics, where it will migrate the damage taken by your active character onto Dehya for about up to 50% if you're at talent level 10. I think there's a lot of things that end up going wrong with how the elemental skill is done. Starting off, the elemental skill has a really terrible uptime issues. It has a 12-second duration but a 40-second downtime, and keep in mind that that 12-second duration cannot be refreshed no matter what. But the second major problem with this mechanics is that you have to be on the elemental skill effect radius for it to actually kick in, which is not actually that big. This is commonly referred to as circle impact, and honestly is rather unpleasant to play. Combine it with the previous point, it means that you're actually gonna have a rather tough time trying to utilize the mechanics here to be your defensive utility, if you can even call it a defensive utility. Overall, during my playthrough, I still find myself have to focus on dodging enemy attack in order to avoid actively taking damage, which raises a really important and interesting question. What's the point of me bringing a defensive utility in the party if I'm going to be actively and focusing on dodging anyway? And just to make it clear, the damage reduction from character like Xingqiu's as well as Dehya, while they do stack, they come in a multiplicative relationship, which means it is not possible to achieve 100% damage reduction by combining characters like Dehya and Xingqiu's, which means no matter what your active characters, while could take less damage, will still take some form of damage, unless you have a hard secondary defensive option, again something like Zhongli, or potentially a healer like Bennett to heal it back up after you have taken damage. Overall, Dehya can hardly serve as a solo defensive utility and will most likely not be enough to cover the defensive utility need for your party. And it has nothing to do with however much HP you build on these characters, as the damage transformation or damage migration is percentage based and is not really affected by however much HP you have. Oh yeah, and I just want to mention that it is totally possible for Dehya to die even off field from the damage migration mechanics, because unlike character like Kuki Shinobu or Hu Tao, she does not have a built-in mechanic to stop taking damage. So yes, you can die even while off field on Dehya. But while Dehya's defensive utility is really lackluster, her damage or her overall offensive utility provided to the party is even worse and could be even argued to be none to be have. In a lot of situations, such as in the Hyper Bloom team, I found it worth considering dropping Dehya for a more offensive orientated characters like a second sub DPS such as Yelan. The thing here is that, as the good old saying go, offense is the best defense. By doing more damage, you're able to defeat the enemy much quicker and therefore reduce the amount of damage you take, which means you're less reliant on defensive utility, but also the fact that when you do more damage, it just gives yourself overall a lot more breathing room. Since you don't have to greed for damage as much, you don't have to push for damage as much. You can overall take your time to play the chamber a little slower to carefully avoid enemy attack, and so it just overall a lot easier than trying to fit a lackluster defensive utility in. So why is it that Dehya has almost no damage or no offensive utility? Well, it kind of ties into how the rest of her kit works. Starting off, once again, going into her elemental skill, skills, when you would trigger a attack onto an enemy in her elemental skill, she can trigger a coordinated attack to apply a small amount of pyro damage once every 2.5 seconds. The pyro application only being able to trigger once every 2.5 seconds is bad enough, but to make the matter worse, it has to be triggered through a coordinated attack, which means you have to attack the enemy with something first, and it can only be triggered around the enemy directly. The overall radius on this pyro application is really small, which means that even if you have an enemy directly next to the original enemy that you're attacking, or you have a Dendro seed right next to it, you still might not apply pyro onto those other things, which means you can hardly trigger burgeon or spread your pyro application at all. To make it a little more clear, this pyro application here is a global cooldown, which means that it can only be triggered once hard every 2.5 seconds. Imagine you have two enemies in front of you and one is on the left while the other one is on the right. You start by attacking the enemy on the left, which trigger the coordinated attack and apply pyro onto them. Great. And then you move on to attack the enemy on the right within the 2.5 seconds. Now, because it has already triggered on the enemy on the left, you actually won't be able to trigger this attack again on the enemy on the right, and therefore you will not apply any pyro on the enemy on the right, which overall, again, just make Dehya have really lackluster, terrible pyro application. If you're wondering if it is possible to use Dehya to apply pyro onto C to be a burgeon DPS, the answer is no, because her power application just isn't good enough. With that being said, let's move on to her elemental burst, which surprisingly was actually worse than I expected. Now, Dehya elemental burst, just like her elemental skill, have really lackluster damage, which again I promise I won't go too deep into, but I just have so many problems on top, starting off with the auto targeting or auto attacking system. When you cast Dehya elemental burst, you enter like this frenzy state where you just automatically attack in front of you, and those attacks do not count as normal attack damage, but instead count only as elemental burst. They don't even count as normal attacking command, unlike Raiden elemental burst. That means unfortunately you cannot trigger things that rely on you issuing a normal attack command like Xingqiu's elemental burst or Fischl's C6. But the overall auto attacking system is so bad, and I kept running into these issues while I was playing the Spiral Abyss Floor 12 Chamber 2 against the Bird and the Scorpion. Here's the problem. Dehya elemental burst will automatically try to attack things in front of it and go toward the things in front of it while you're in its duration, even though you might not intend to attack that thing or to just reposition yourself. Here's one of the problems I was running into when I was playing Spiral Abyss. I would be spawning on the Bird and I'll cast the elemental burst. Now, while I was casting the elemental burst, I actually don't really want to attack the Bird because it has high power resistance. Instead, I want to attack the Scorpion Electro. But because of the fact that the elemental burst keep on moving me toward the Pyro Bird and as the nearest enemy, I actually cannot move toward the Electro Scorpion at all. It just wouldn't let me. But there's actually more problem than that. You see, the Bird or the Scorpion sometimes like to do this AOD attack where it generates a AOD indicator on the ground and then a few seconds later it attack that exact spot. Now there's a couple ways to avoid this attack, and one of the first one is to just dash at the exact moment it lands, which means you can use the iframe during the dash to avoid taking any damage. But a simpler one that most people are probably a little bit more accustomed to is simply to run out of the circle. But what is the problem on trying to dodge it during your Dehya elemental burst? You see, while you're trying to dash away from the indicator on the ground, Dehya will actively move you back toward the center of the circle because it attempts to attack the nearest object and move you forward in front of it. And the end result is that, just like previously, you cannot reposition yourself. You cannot dash off the circle as it continuously attempts to put you back in it, and therefore you can't avoid it. Actually, overall, I found it harder to avoid damage when I'm casting the elemental burst, and it's just overall harder to reposition yourself because of all these kind of auto-attacking mechanics. Something interesting about the elemental burst is that if you jump during her elemental burst, it will actually cancel off your elemental burst. I have no idea why this is the case. This seems to be the first case of it in Genshin Impact. And while this might not seem a big deal, there might be a time where this is just annoying. For example, you're trying to jump over those rocks sliding attack by the Geo Aura. You can't do that because you cancel off your elemental burst. To nitpick on the elemental burst a little bit more, it really doesn't help that her elemental burst has a short duration of 4 seconds, which is just awkward enough to fit into rotation. Because again, her elemental burst just doesn't do a lot of things, like you can't reposition or you can't use things like Xingqiu's elemental burst. It feels like you're just grieving the rest of your party. When you cast the elemental burst, it is 4-second loss of duration on your Xingqiu's elemental burst, which might not be pleasant. And if you think I'm done talking about the problem on her burst, well, you got them wrong, because she is actually really energy hungry. You see, her elemental burst has an energy cost of 70, but the problem is that her elemental skill generates almost no power energy. Her elemental skill does not generate power energy energy on the initial cast or recast and only generate power energy during the coordinated attack once every 2.5 seconds. And the amount of power energy that she generates is one single power energy. In comparison to something like Bennett, who has a 4-second elemental skill cooldown on his elemental skill, but is capable of generating 2 to 3 power energy every single time. Bennett generating power energy in a batch also make it easier to funnel into another character like Xiangling, while Dehya elemental skill generate energy one by one through coordinated attack, which means you're actually gonna have trouble funneling the energy back into Dehya herself, as for the most part, your Dehya is gonna be off field during those attacks. And when you do get field time on Dehya, which is through her elemental burst, they actually remove your elemental skill, which means you no longer trigger those coordinated attack, and therefore you completely stop generating any power energy while Dehya is on field. And again, which means you can't funnel power energy onto her. Even when you're running mono pyro, which involves 3 pyro characters into your party, you actually still have to run a hefty amount of energy recharge onto your Dehya, which is really troublesome. For the most part, Dehya is honestly just a liability in your party, and often, if not always, is worse than a alternative different characters, or just not putting anything in that slot at all. For example, starting off with the infamous national team, you have Bennett, Xiangling, Xingqiu as your core, and while you can put Dehya here to get a little bit more quote-unquote defensive utility by taking the damage onto Dehya, as a matter of fact, Dehya actively grieve your damage. Dehya will apply just enough pyro to start taking away vaporize from Xiangling, but not enough for it to be meaningful at all. Not to mention, when you do eventually cast the elemental burst, if you do have the energy, then you can no longer trigger the elemental burst attack on Xingqiu's, and you stop applying hydro, as well as you just lose all those damage from Xingqiu's elemental burst. The same go with a lot of other party in the game, like Hyper Bloom. Their elemental burst grieve your Xingqiu's elemental burst, and you can no longer apply hydro or do damage on Xingqiu's anymore, and Dehya's power application is just enough to grieve the Hyper Bloom triggers while not exactly being useful. It doesn't really mean that there are absolutely no team where Dehya can fit into. There are some teams that you can potentially look to utilize Dehya, like Mel Ganyu, which is one of the things that many people are currently experimenting right now. Dehya elemental skill, when you cast, actually do provide you with interrupt resistance, which allow you to cast Ganyu charge attack easily. But the problem is that for some reason, even though the field has a 12-second duration, the interrupt resistance actually only lasts for 9 seconds. And overall, during my playthrough, I found that to be just a little too short, plus the fact that it doesn't match up with her field duration is really annoying. And again, just like many other times where if you're actively looking for a defensive utility, then you could always consider just running Zhongli instead, which will most likely just be a much better pull for your account if that's what you truly value. Mono Pyro is another team where many people are experimenting with, and to give credit where it is due, I do think this team worked quite okay, and I do have a lot of fun playing this team, and I think it has acceptable performance from the fact that you have Bennett, Xiangling, and Kazuha. It also helps circumvent many of the Dehya issues, like the fact that her elemental burst doesn't work with Xingqiu's all year long, but it worked with Xiangling because Xiangling power needle keeps spinning anyway, and so Mono Pyro might just be the go-to team for Dehya. Plus the fact that you already have Bennett mean that you don't have to worry too much about the defensive utility as well. I'm actually considering making a separate video about this because I do think people kind of is a little too harsh on Dehya, because Mono Pyro is actually, in my opinion, a rather okay team. Of course, the main problem comes from the fact that putting any other characters into this party is just most likely better than putting Dehya from, like, say, a off-field electro character like Fischl's that start to do off-field damage with Oz plus apply electro, so you can do overload damage on your Bennett. Plus it allows you to put Bennett on field better to generate even more power energy for your Xiangling. Putting a character like Zhongli in would honestly even just be as good. You can shred the power resistance through his elemental skill, which is another 20% power resistance shred. Plus the fact that you can run something like Petra on your Zhongli to give 35% power damage to both your Bennett and Xiangling. And again, you can just put Bennett on field here to do a lot of damage, potentially even just a lot more damage than Dehya. In fact, I was told by some field crafter that Xinyan is actually even just better than Dehya here. It is actually really weird because Dehya almost just doesn't do anything, to the point where almost any other character you can possibly put into your party is likely better than putting her into the party, which is really unfortunate. But even then, the thing that she tried to do, she doesn't even do it that well. And sometimes it could even be a liability in your party by, well, potentially grieving some of your interaction or some of your uptime. So at the very least though, Dehya do have one really good thing about her, and that is her looks. She definitely is one of the hottest characters in the game, to be honest, one of the coolest personality in the game, and I'll not let anyone say anything else otherwise. Woo! At this moment, just through my first impression of Dehya, it is very difficult for me to recommend ever pulling on these characters. In fact, my advice would actually be, if you're someone who is looking to pull for meta's reason, this is a character you should never ever pull for. as by meta definition, it is very likely that this character is unplayable. Now, maybe we would be wrong. Maybe someone will come up with a better solution to play with Dehya that she end up being somewhat playable in the Genshin Impact meta, and maybe we can talk about that in a future update video in the 1 week in meta analysis. I do also think that people are a little too harsh on her, saying that she's completely broken and doesn't work at all, because she is okay if you're not really looking to play for meta reason and you just really want to play with Dehya. I think mono pirate Dehya is in an okay slash acceptable spot, but that is not for this video. Maybe it's a separate video. So as always, if you're not subscribed already, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment below. I don't always respond to them, but I do kind of read them. So yeah, if this video is a little harsh, then I apologize. But for people who are watching this video, you guys probably care about the meta. So yeah, bye.